Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, an inquest jury has found serious failings by police and ambulance staff led to the death of Leon Briggs in 2013. The jury found the mixed-race father should have been treated as a medical emergency when he was detained under the Mental Health Act while suffering a psychotic episode. Instead, he was heavily restrained and later left face down and dying on the floor of a police cell. And a warning, this report from Simon Israel, who's covered this story for the last 4 years, contains disturbing footage.
Margaret Briggs has had to wait more than 7 years, nearly 2,700 days, for her moment of truth.
All we have wanted was to understand how a vulnerable man who needed help could end up dead in police custody.
On the 4th of November 2013, her mentally troubled son Leon suffered a drug-induced psychotic episode on a high street. His behaviour was erratic, his actions unpredictable. He darted into an off-licence, and when he left, the 39-year-old father was detained by firearms officers under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. The inquest heard how he was brought to the ground, then restrained, at times face down, for close to a quarter of an hour, just out of sight of CCTV. With his legs clamped and hands cuffed behind his back, Mr. Briggs was carried to a caged van, which conveyed him not to a hospital, but to Luton Police Station. On arrival, Mr. Briggs was still struggling, agitated and confused. Within minutes of being carried through the custody suite and again being placed face down, this time in a cell, Mr. Briggs was about to become yet another statistic for deaths in police custody. His mother has never been able to bring herself to watch what happened to her son. But she supported Channel 4 News in its legal challenge for release of the footage so others could view what happened.
Because I wanted the world to see how my son was treated.
She's had to rely on an inquest jury to comprehend these distressing pictures. They show him left on a cell floor in what was described at the inquest as a dangerous prone position, and his shouting replaced by silence, with his life fast ebbing away when the cell door swiped his feet as it closed. The calling of his name brought no response, yet the cell is not reopened for another 3 minutes. By then, it's too late. The jury's conclusions convey the shortcomings of a tragedy all 6 trained police officers maintained they tried everything to avoid. They found the primary cause of death was a combination of prone restraint, both on the street and in the cell, prolonged struggle, and amphetamine intoxication. Among the serious failures were inappropriate use of force and the failure to recognise the need for urgent medical attention in the cell. And finally, the jury's decision: neglect contributed to the death of Leon Briggs. His family had pushed for unlawful killing. They hoped this would be one of the first tests of a ruling by the Supreme Court late last year, which lowered the standard of proof in such inquests. It's no longer beyond reasonable doubt as in a criminal trial, but now on the balance of probabilities. They left today disappointed.
Not the kind of closure we wanted.
It's not the kind of closure we wanted.
Acting Sergeant Lawrence Short sectioned Mr. Briggs under the Mental Health Act, restrained him, then opted for police custody because Mr. Briggs, he said, was unmanageable. Experts told the inquest he should have been treated as a medical emergency, but wasn't. Not a single officer has faced a disciplinary panel over what they did or didn't do on that day and what happened inside Luton Police Station in 2013. Hours and hours of questioning by independent investigators was met by all officers with no comment. Each one of them said they were following legal advice. Their own force ultimately offered no evidence to a disciplinary panel a year ago.
I don't believe the officers have anything to apologise for. They went, they did their job, and they did it to the best of their capability that day.
But there was an apology today from the police force itself.
The family and friends of Leon Briggs have had to wait far too long to hear all the facts surrounding his death, and our thoughts are, of course, with them at this very difficult time. The jury has today identified a number of significant failings by the police which contributed to the death of Mr. Briggs, and for this we are truly sorry.
No peace!
Mrs. Briggs is well aware her son's death is not an isolated case. She's been on demonstrations with other families who have lost their sons in similar fashion. The death of Leon Briggs and new guidelines have had a major impact on mental health care locally. In Bedfordshire, Section 136 detainees have been taken into police custody only 3 times in the last 4 years. But among other forces in England and Wales, there's a more worrying picture, with police custody being used as a last resort nearly 2,000 times in the same period. The last 20 years is scarred with a list of men, mostly black, where restraint has triggered death. The organisation Inquest has sent an alarming report to the United Nations documenting these cases.
The excessive delays and obfuscation by the police, the lack of accountability and impunity, and the failure to address structural racism within our policing and other public bodies means that these deaths continue.
The Briggs family remain beset with anger. They believe the force has sought to obfuscate and blur the abject failures. And the coroner today said Leon Briggs had been so very let down by both police and ambulance services.
That report from Simon Israel.
The trial of 2 police officers over the death of a retired footballer has heard how the victim was tasered for 6 times the recommended amount. Dalian Atkinson died in 2016 after the police were called to his father's home in Telford. Our Home Affairs correspondent Darshana Soni reports now from Birmingham, where the trial opened today.
They're accused of lashing out in anger, of intending to cause serious injury. PC Benjamin Monk in the black mask denies murder and manslaughter. Next to him, PC Mary Ellen Betley Smith, who denies assault. The jury at Birmingham Crown Court heard that the 2 officers were in a relationship at the time of the incident, and that if it wasn't for their actions, Dalian Atkinson would still be alive. 48-year-old Mr. Atkinson had enjoyed a career as a successful footballer, most notably for Aston Villa between 91 and 95. After retiring in 2001, Mr. Atkinson had had a number of serious health issues, including high blood pressure and heart disease. He was also on dialysis. The jury was told that whilst these underlying health conditions meant the footballer was at an increased risk of dying, if it wasn't for the way he was tasered and kicked, he would not have died. In the early hours of August 15, 2016, Mr. Atkinson went to his father's house in Telford. According to witnesses, he was agitated, distressed, and shouting that he was the Messiah. A neighbour called 999. The prosecution said the police were confronted with a man clearly acting in a disturbed and erratic way, and that they were entitled to use reasonable force to defend themselves, but the behaviour of the accused officers went beyond this. PC Monk tasered Mr. Atkinson twice to no effect. He then fired again. According to the prosecutor, Mr. Atkinson's death was caused by the police officer's actions. PC Monk tasered the footballer. The jury heard that when a taser trigger is pulled, it emits a 5-second burst of electricity, but PC Monk overrode this, holding the trigger for 33 seconds. He then kicked the footballer so hard that it left an imprint. The jury heard distressing evidence from some of the neighbours, who said after he was tasered, Mr. Atkinson fell to the ground and was unresponsive, no longer posing a threat. PC Monk then delivered a massive and powerful kick to his head, as though he were kicking a football. PC Betley Smith hit the footballer repeatedly with her baton. Mr Atkinson's brother was in court and listened as the jury were told the two officers then sat on the footballer to handcuff him. A witness described Dalian Atkinson as making horrendous noises, clearly having trouble breathing. Both police officers deny the charges against them, and the trial is expected to last until June.
The court heard that PC Monk had served 14 years with West Mercia Police at the time of the incident. He'd been trained to use a taser in 2010 and then retrained in May 2016. That's just 3 months before this incident. By contrast, the prosecution say, PC Betley Smith was by some margin considerably less experienced. Now, the prosecution say that when the officers arrived at Mr Atkinson's house, the footballer was clearly agitated and distressed. A neighbour says that at one point he smashed the window of his dad's house. The prosecution say that officers had every right to defend themselves and one another. But this case centres on what happened when that third taser shot was fired, on the length of time that the trigger was held for, and when Mr Atkinson was lying there unconscious and unresponsive, when he was assaulted with a baton and kicked. Now, the prosecution alleged that when the ambulance turned up, Mr PC Monk was alleged to have said to them, "He may be a bit bloody, I've had to kick him." Both officers deny all of the charges against them, and tomorrow the prosecution will continue to outline their case against them.
Darshna, thanks very much.
A police officer accused of murdering the former footballer Dalian Atkinson lied about kicking him in the head as he lay on the street after being tasered, a court has been told. 42-year-old PC Benjamin Monk has denied murdering Mr Atkinson in August 2016, while his fellow constable, 31-year-old Mary Ellen Betley Smith, has denied charges of assault. Our Home Affairs correspondent Darshna Soni was in court and joins us now live. Darshna.
PC Monk is accused of hitting Dalian Atkinson with his taser 6 times than is recommended, and he's also accused of then kicking him as he lay there unconscious. PC Betley Smith is accused of assaulting him by hitting him with her baton as he lay there. Now today, Matt, the two defence barristers were allowed to address the jury. PC Monk's barrister told the jury that there's no dispute the officer had kicked Dalian Atkinson, but the question is why? They will argue that he didn't act in anger, but because he was terrified of Dalian Atkinson. They'll also be disputing some of the medical evidence about the cause of death. PC Betley Smith's barrister told the jury that her client had acted reasonably and lawfully because she too was terrified, that she perceived Dalian Atkinson to be violent and threatening. Her barrister also said that the jury should put what happened into context, that PC Betley Smith was inexperienced, she was in a pressurised situation, and she was still on probation. She'd only joined the police force a year earlier. But the prosecution rejected this version of events. They told the jury that the two officers who were in a relationship had colluded over their version of events to present them in the best possible light. They've accused PC Monk of lying in his initial interview when he told his interviewer that he had only kicked Dalian Atkinson once in the shoulder when he knew that this wasn't true. The prosecution say that the two of them were trying to present what happened in the best possible light. After that, we heard from Dalian Atkinson's girlfriend, Karen Wright. She broke down as she recalled what had happened on the night of his death. We then heard from a neighbour who had been up late watching the tennis when she heard shouting. She looked out of her window and saw Dalian Atkinson acting aggressively, so she dialed 999. And this case is about what happened when the police got there and how they responded to Dalian Atkinson. Both officers deny all of the charges against them, and the case continues.
Thanks, Darshna. We start with a harrowing case of violence by a police officer towards a vulnerable teenage girl. Tonight, this programme has spoken exclusively to one of her relatives, on condition of anonymity, who's seen video footage of the attack. PC Benjamin Kemp was dismissed after hitting the 16-year-old more than 30 times with a baton, as well as spraying CS gas in her face. Her family are calling for the CPS to reconsider its decision not to bring criminal charges against him. Here's Simon Israel.
A short stroll from Newham Hospital, and this traffic junction in East London became the scene for one of the worst cases of unjustified police violence in recent years. What happened here on this waste ground in May 2019, 2 years ago, was captured on CCTV and police officers' body-worn video. But that footage has never been shown beyond the confines of the Metropolitan Police and the Independent Office for Police Conduct. But it served as crucial evidence last week in the gross misconduct case against one officer, which was held in private. The victim's relative, who attended the hearing, describes the footage as horrific. We have agreed to protect her identity for the welfare of the victim herself, known as XAB.
Yes, we see it on TV, and we've seen it in the news, and we see it a lot in America. But I would never thought that I would be sitting here having to talk about a member of my family being subjected to such force and brutality from the police. The black female victim was just 17 with learning difficulties. She ran off from an escorted walk, distressed, and flagged down a police car at this junction. Yet she was then subjected to being CS sprayed, beaten with a police baton at a rate of 2 strikes a second for at least a minute, as she tells officers she needs help and that she has mental health problems. First thing she said was, "I'm a mental health patient, I'm vulnerable." Those were her words. The male officer started to talk to her aggressively and telling her, "You need to calm down, you need to calm down," and started going through his handcuffs. And as soon as Miss XAB saw the handcuffs, she was saying, "Well, you're going to hurt me, you're going to hurt me, I haven't done anything, I haven't done anything." She was just frightened. Miss XAB calmed down sufficiently for the female officer to walk off, and it was while she had gone off that PC Kemp then resorted to getting
the
out.
baton came out.
The baton came out, exactly.
And what happened?
He just kept striking her. He was striking her. He said he gave 3 to 4 strikes first to try and get her down to the back of the knee, to try and get her down. But obviously that didn't work. And then he just kept going.
More than 30 strikes?
More than 30 strikes. In the space of a minute.
In the space of a minute?
In the space of a minute.
And had she done anything to provoke that?
Absolutely nothing at all. Not a crossword, not even a raised voice.
What impact did this all have on her?
Terrible impact. She's quite literally afraid of the police right now. Feels that everybody's out to hurt her. In fact, anybody in a uniform, so it's not just the police now, anybody in a uniform is out to hurt her, and she can't understand why. As she said, she did nothing wrong. She did nothing wrong.
No one argues that the welfare of the victim is paramount and her identity be protected. But equally, no one underestimates the potential impact if the footage is ever revealed in public. Her cousin believes what happened is not just about her family.
The family have asked for it to remain out of the public, but if it wasn't for the fact that Miss XAB, her welfare and her mental state is my first and priority concern, we would have said, this needs to be out there, people need to see this. This is not the norm, this is not the norm. I don't really want to go with the George Floyd incident, but it's along those lines.
PC Benjamin Kemp was sacked last week. Unlike someone convicted of crimes, the Metropolitan Police did not issue a mugshot. There were no criminal charges in this case. His unjustified violence was described by the Met as an overreaction.
I would say that there's a balance. It was unacceptable. I apologise from the bottom of my heart. But I would say is always remember, today your officers are out there serving the public in the way that's in line with their values and in line with the expectations of Londoners.
But I'm not clear yet what the explanation is for PC Kemp's behaviour.
I wasn't there. I haven't spoken to PC Kemp.
You've seen the video?
I've seen the video. I can give an opinion. I think he was confronted with the scene that he lost control very, very quickly. He had his equipment there. He used it inappropriately and disproportionately. I don't know why he reacted that way.
The Met is now liaising with London's mental health trusts to learn lessons. But the case of XAB is far from over. The family are to ask for criminal charges to be reconsidered following the officer's dismissal. Why no criminal charges then?
The family now want the CPS to review the case. We understand that the CPS did make a decision much earlier on at the conclusion of the IOPC investigation, and they concluded that no charges should be brought.
The investigation by the Independent Office for Police Conduct found no evidence of racial bias or disability discrimination. The family is not so sure. They do not think, with the Met's record, this can be seen in isolation. And while the force has publicly apologised, nothing has been conveyed directly to the victim or her family.
Simon Israel reporting. Well, I'm joined now by Victor Elisa. He's a retired chief superintendent with the Metropolitan Police. Thank you very much for coming on the programme again. I mean, this is a really shocking case. To hear the police officer's violence against this teenage girl described as as overreaction is a terrible understatement, isn't it?
It is, but you've got to understand that the comment that the BCU commander, Richard Tucker, has made is about as forceful as we've heard from a serving senior police officer for a long, long time. So you've got to take that into account, and that exemplifies the seriousness of this case. By any standards, it's shocking, and I think we've got to commend the member of the family who you just interviewed in the sense of they don't want that video to be made public. And I can only imagine that the nature of that video would cause significant disruption and concern to the public. So we've got to commend them for that, but we've got to understand the comments that the officers have made. It's really forceful, and you hardly ever hear that from any officers, let alone senior police officers.
But the family would also argue that justice has not been served, and they want the CPS to reconsider charges here. Do you think the CPS should file criminal charges against this police officer?
I think, at the very least, the CPS should review their decision of whether or not there's sufficient evidence to charge. And I also think, having done that, the CPS needs to explain on what basis they've reached that decision. So the criteria on which they can make a decision whether or not to charge could include whether or not there's sufficient evidence to secure a conviction, but there's also the criteria whether it's in the public interest. Now, if the CPS have made a decision not to charge based on the public interest, that would be shocking, because we've got a case now which is roundly condemned by senior officers, and this is described as an officer who acted beyond his powers, beyond the training that was given to them. It's incumbent that the CPS review it, because there's not only trust in the police system, but there's trust in the criminal justice system. And the CPS needs to play its part for communities. And the IPC said this is not affected by any issues of race or disability, but you will have communities, people from the black community, who will question whether or not race didn't play a part. So it's really important that the CPS, as part of the criminal justice system, do make a decision and explain their decision to actually continue to help to build that trust.
Because what's also really shocking is that the IOPC, the Independent Office of Police Conduct, originally just recommended misconduct, not even gross misconduct. And then, let me just broaden this out as well. You look at all these other cases of violence against people of colour suffering mental health issues. Kevin Clark, 2018, arrested by 9 officers in Lewisham while suffering an acute behavioural disturbance, died shortly afterwards in hospital. I mean, there are just too many cases like this. So what has to be done in order to address this?
There are too many cases like this, and that is the real worry, in the sense of, we look at this case and it's almost portrayed in the sense of a single bad apple. So one officer who behaves incredibly badly. But there were other officers who were there. There's a description of the officers who pulled out and used their CS spray. Okay, the IPC saying that, they acted within reasonable. But it's a consistent pattern that actually just leads to a question about, is the organisation that's the Met learning from the incidents over time? Is the police institution learning? And why is it seems to be so consistently on black people?
Not learning fast enough. Very briefly, what should be happening right now to make this go away?
But what should be happening right now, the IOPC should actually explain how they came to a decision in the first place. The police have apologised and they should get back and actually say, these are the things that we've done to prevent this happening by training officers and monitoring them. And the CPS ought to come clean and actually explain why they don't think there's sufficient evidence to charge this officer. If those things are done and those things are done quickly, then we can get into a position where we have a better understanding as members of the public and we start building trust in the criminal justice system, police, CPS, and those institutions that hold the police to account, the IOPC.
Got to leave it there. Victor, Lisa, thank you very much indeed.